During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, if one were to ask which of the European powers held the greatest potential to achieve global dominance, the answer probably wouldn't have been Britain or then just England, but rather, France. By this point in time, the age of the Spanish Empire was setting, and that of France rose to seemingly take its place. Geographically, France found itself in one of the most strategically valuable locations on all the continent, having simultaneous access to the Atlantic, the turbulent Holy Roman Empire and the Italian states, as well as its hegemon predecessor of Spain. Geography aside, the kingdom boasted a massive population, easily multiple times the size of its neighbors, something which would contribute to the creation of an intimidating land army, and at the time one of Europe's leading navies. That is, until financial limitations hindered further development. The nation during this time owed a great deal of its glory to the ambitious King Louis XIV, better known as Louis the Great or the Sun King. It was under Louis that France not only became a truly centralized state, but adopted a militant and expansionist character which ensured it would not merely stutter to life, but awaken with a roaring boom. This being said, France had not been without its handicaps, foremost having been, as we previously mentioned, a hindering economy. Louis had inherited a treasury on the brink of bankruptcy, but with the aid of capable ministers was able to implement an effective tax code which brought about a level of normality. This, however, would not be enough to fund Louis's ambitious plans, and thus taxes needed to be raised. While nobles did bear a tax burden, because of an older agreement which essentially exchanged power for privileges, the nobles and upper classes were often exempt from major taxation. Had this been changed, the nobles would gain greater governmental authority and thus pose a threat to Louis's centralized system, producing a precarious arrangement which was now quickly falling off balance. Tax collection itself had been ineffective during the period, as collectors often charged a commission fee which skimmed off a substantial portion of revenue meant for the government. Despite these setbacks, France would not shy away from conflicts it saw as strategically valuable or necessary over the years, even once Louis the Great had passed away and in the wake of poor harvests and shortages. These economic troubles would later be the foundational drivers of the French Revolution, which of course brought a momentary end to the French kingdom. As we explained in a previous video, it's commonly understood that the French kingdom's chances for imperial greatness came to an end following its defeat at the hands of Britain during the 7 Years' War, a conflict which had cost the kingdom its colonies in New France and its hold over India, seeing to it that Britain would in fact become the new global power instead. However, this was less the decider of France's rise and more the indication of its fall. Of course, in a world where France falls, its rival of Britain will rise, and vice versa. But France's true opportunity to assume the role of an uncontested global power had in fact come during the War of Spanish Succession. We previously gave France the optimal outcome in regards to the 7 Years' War, touching on the fact that a French victory could have meant various things with a wide range of effects, from France remaining on top to eventually being surpassed by Britain once again through a colonial reconquest. This greater uncertainty surrounding France's hypothetical future is lifted when we turn back the years to 1701. The Spanish King Charles II had died childless, and in his will he named King Louis's grandson Philip, Duke of Anjou, as his successor. However, Charles' passing had been of no surprise to any of the European powers, and though Spain's imperial strength had left it long ago, its territorial possessions remained in large part intact. And so Britain, the Netherlands, and others circled Spain like vultures waiting to pick at its bloated carcass. Charles' abrupt decision to appoint Philip as his successor fizzled away these hopes, determined not to allow the breakup of Spanish lands, even if it meant upsetting the European balance of power. The Austrians, who felt they too held a right to the throne, also having been of the Habsburg line, asserted their own claim against France for the whole of Spain and its colonial possessions. The British and Dutch did not want to see either France nor Austria unite with Spain, knowing full well that either would prove a great threat to their own plans for imperial growth. However, at the time, France seemed to pose a greater threat and stood as a mutual rival to the Grand Alliance, while assumptions were that the Austrian claim to the throne would rule exclusively within Spain and not constitute a united Habsburg Empire. However, toward the later years of the war, the Austrian contender would assume the role of Holy Roman Emperor, whilst Charles of Anjou was suddenly propelled to heir apparent of the French throne, meaning regardless of which side won, Britain and the Netherlands would be gravely disadvantaged by the outcome. And so, as support for Austria waned and France remained surrounded by enemies, a compromise was put forward which would attempt to appease all parties, but which in truth would deny France a total victory, while providing to Britain the material it would need to secure its imperial strategy for the next half-century. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline France managed to overcome a continent of adversaries and pull its undivided prize from the debris of war? The matter of course becomes a question of how. Commonly proposed as points in which the tides of war could have turned dramatically are during the battles of Blenheim and of Schellenberg. both of which contributed to a deterring of a French invasion and capture of the Austrian capital. Had Vienna been captured, the Grand Alliance would have certainly fractured, leaving perhaps only Britain as a persistent combatant for the sole sake of negotiating France out of an unconditional victory. France and its few Western allies weren't the only threat Austria needed to face, mind you, as within its own domain arose a Hungarian war for independence led by Francis Rákosi. The Battle of Blenheim, ironically like the later Battle of Rosbach during the 7 Years' War, would have allowed the French to link up with their allies and assure an unrelenting final push on their opponent. In the latter case, this had been the French and Austrians against Prussia, and in this case would be the French, Bavarians, and Hungarians against Austria. With that front of the war closed, France would have, for most intents and purposes, secured Philip's place as King of Spain in the eyes of most of Europe, and as of this point he would not have yet been made heir apparent to France, as his father and older brother would not pass away for another 5 or 6 years, allowing most of the European powers to let their guard down for a time, with of course the exception of Britain, who could still stand to negotiate for access to Spanish trade in the Caribbean as they had in our world. While it's likely France would negotiate for an earlier peace, no doubt with far less favorable terms for Britain, whether or not France does continue to combat the British does not change the fact that in this world they're much more likely to become a non-factor sooner or later. Without a favorable victory, Britain is unlikely to acquire the ports of Gibraltar and Minorca, as well as exclusive rights to the slave trade in Spanish America, two major gains which contributed to Britain's successful growth as a trade superpower in the following years. Further, the peace agreement of our world had led to a French acceptance of the Hanoverian succession, a significant issue as since 1701 Louis had recognized the Catholic James Francis Edward Stuart as the legitimate claim to the British throne. Being the son of James II, who had been deposed in the Glorious Revolution, Francis Edward Stuart seemingly had a greater claim to the throne following his sister Queen Anne's death than the Hanoverians had. However, recent law had restricted Catholics from taking the throne and thus left him a pretender. As you might imagine, the adopting of a foreign king was not met very well by many who were already disgruntled by Britain's participation in the War of Spanish Succession, which had just ended months prior, and in this alternate world would have left Britain with a significant war debt. In our world, riots broke out across England, and months later a Jacobite uprising had taken place within Scotland and Cornwall, with the aim of overthrowing the Hanoverian king and placing James on the throne. Because Britain had appeased France in our world by allowing Philip to take the Spanish throne, with the exception that he renounced the French throne, the two began a brief rapprochement, one additionally fueled by the fact that Louis the Great had just passed away, and with Philip gone, the only heir that remained was a 5-year-old Louis XV who was not ready to go to war with Britain. Likewise, Britain's leadership was also not in the most stable of states following Queen Anne's passing. In this alternate world, things are very, very different. Louis the Great passes away confidently knowing that he is being succeeded by Philip in a personal union between France and Spain, just 1 year after the war's end. It's been interpreted as a condition of Charles II's will that a union was not to be established, as provisions were made in the event that Philip turned down the Spanish throne for that of France. However, Louis personally saw to securing Philip's rights to the French throne under those conditions, something which actually fueled the fires of war between France and the Grand Alliance early on, and led to the strict specification that the crowns remain separate in the peace treaty. Such would not be the case in this alternate world. France, having fought off the major powers of Europe almost all on its own and won, would be far less inclined to compromise with its rivals and certainly seek to neutralize them wherever it could. Following the model of his grandfather, Philip would seize on the opportunity to create a strategic asset out of what would have otherwise been a potential threat, by fanning the flames of the coronation riots in Britain and lending support to the Jacobite uprising of 1715, lending direct funds and resources to the Jacobites, providing speedy transport for James Francis Edward Stuart, and offering naval support off the coast of Cornwall. Stuart in our world had later acquired the partial support of Philip's Spain in another attempt, but this had been far less successful for a number of reasons, including a loss of momentum within the British public, poor weather conditions, the greater strength of both Britain and its new monarchy, not to mention a significant loss in the prior year during what had actually been part of a larger plan for Philip to retake the French throne. In this alternate timeline, with the combined strength of Spain and France directed in support of the Jacobites, victory in a restoration war would not be far out of the realm of possibility. Britain at this point had been heavily dependent on mercenaries for its land army, and given the potential domestic support which could be riled up by the Jacobites, the outcome for the Hanoverians would not look very optimistic. We may expect the Netherlands to involve themselves given their strategic position between Hanover and England. However, this may just as well see an escalation of the war on the European mainland, with Hanover and the Netherlands coming under heavy threat of French invasion. Stuart would be crowned king and maintain close ties with France, being allowed trade and military benefits in exchange for a limiting of British naval expansion, perhaps even seeing to the construction of new vessels for France's exclusive use. The new British king had been brought up for most of his life in France by his exiled parents, and was no doubt raised to be a valuable asset to King Louis and now King Philip. But even though a military victory might have been drawn by the French-backed Jacobites, unrest within England specifically toward the new Catholic order would no doubt grow, only being suppressed by French military might and attempted policies of religious tolerance echoing those of the prior King James II, and perhaps, much as was the case then, these policies would prove ineffective in reducing interfaith conflict. The colonies would be a little different, as Catholicism had not had an optimistic track record there, the Catholic population at the time in the 13 colonies being approximately 2% of the total population, with perhaps slightly more practicing covertly. What this could suggest is that while Britain may be knocked out of the imperial game, we can expect further resistance of the new Catholic dynasty, most prominently within the British colonies and England itself, something which may see to the breakup of the United Kingdom into its constituent states, or the division of England alone along religious and cultural lines, much like was later seen in Ireland. Domestically, Philip would see to the centralization of Spain in the French fashion, just as was done through the Nueva Planta decrees in our world. The notable difference might be that instead of centralizing Spain on its own, we may instead see an incorporation of the Spanish territories into the French system. Overall, making full use of Spanish and French resources, Philip would attempt to alleviate the shortages experienced within France while stimulating Spain's stagnant economy through an encouraging of settlement in Louisiana, the regulating of the upper classes, and promoting of various sectors from agriculture to industry. Despite this, France and Spain would still face some financial troubles during these early years, however certainly come further along than they had in our world, thanks to streamlined economic cooperation and adoption of various lucrative trade opportunities that would have gone to Britain instead. The Spanish colonies would also see more extensive use and development, as they'd now be serviced by a dominant and ever-expanding French fleet, instead of the massively diminished Spanish fleet. In later years, the Bourbon Kingdom would meddle in other European affairs, such as the War of Polish Succession and War of Austrian Succession, although admittedly it may have less motivation to do so, as Austria would have already been significantly weakened by its prior loss and thus not pose very much of a threat to future French plans. However, depending on what relations may develop in the wake of the alternate Spanish Succession War, France may still see a valuable opportunity to strategically position itself in the east against the rising power of Russia, and would not hesitate to do so at Austria's expense. Given that Austria would be in a weaker position and France now had a major eastern ally in the form of Hungary, the Polish Succession War would see a more favorable outcome for France, but once again bring to light the extent of Russian capabilities and prime it to become a long-standing adversary in the near future. It's also noteworthy to point out that without Britain repeatedly opposing France in conflicts of the period, the overseas colonies experience a relative level of peace compared to our world, albeit still needing to deal with occasional uprisings and wars with native tribes. While the culture of the colonies remains distinct and embraces more republican ideals than England itself had, there's much less hostility between colonials and their overseas brothers, at least the ones who weren't Catholic anyhow, perhaps suggesting that a future reconciliation in place of a war for independence was possible between the colonies and the now independent Protestant English kingdom. Once again, with Austria in its weakened state and French allies now littering the region, the War of Austrian Succession would see French allied Bavaria invade and conquer Vienna. This had been attempted in our world but fell through due to French troops being redirected to Bohemia instead. Charles VII had been Prince Elector of Bavaria, briefly Holy Roman Emperor, and King of Bohemia, but he may just as easily have become King of Austria instead, uniting the realm with his own into an Austro-Bavarian kingdom, and bringing about a new pro-French order in the Holy Roman Empire, at least until his own death 3 years later, when his pro-Habsburg son would take power. This could lead to an early War of Bavarian Succession if France caught wind of these leanings. No matter if that's the case, a War of Bavarian Succession had occurred in our world regardless, but was a fairly minor event. In this alternate world, it could have easily amounted to a second War of Austrian Succession, given the significant former Austrian lands that would now be up for grabs. This would lead France into direct rivalry with Prussia, who held ambitions in Central Europe, and would perceive any French-selected contender to the throne as little more than a puppet. King Philip and his successors, unlike the ineffective Louis XV, would lead France forward in not merely military might, but in Enlightenment thought as well. Philip's son Charles III had famously come to be known as the Enlightened Despot, or the Philosopher King, titles also attributed to Frederick the Great of Prussia, whom had exploited French prudence to siphon off a number of their intellectuals, who in this world would instead remain where they belong. Much like in our world, we'd see the monarchy attempt to separate clerical authority from the church to instead strengthen that of the king, as not merely the nobles but clergy had come to form an unproductive burden which hindered the power of the king and hoarded resources away from the masses. A significant adjustment period could be expected, as several of these economic and social reforms did in fact spawn riots in our timeline. However, even if the positive results are not immediately felt, the prosperity secured within the kingdoms thanks to the reliable stream of wealth and resources now being drawn in from the colonies would ensure that any risk of revolution on the scale of that which occurred in France would be incredibly low, and in fact diminish over the years as the peasant class shrunk and a wider-ranging middle class began to take form. The colonies would see reorganization based on extent of settlement and location of resources so that they might be better equipped and subsidized by the mainland, allowing for the construction of more ports and ships, which in turn would facilitate more efficient trade within the empire. Faith and cultural divisions within southeast Britain would drive closer relations with the neighboring Netherlands, which in turn would have reopened regular communication with Hanover. The three coming to establish a close alliance for mutual security and economic development in a move against French power. Prussia and Russia, as in our world now with the exclusion of Austria, sensing the changing tides of power in Europe once again, would move to partition the increasingly politically insignificant lands of Poland between themselves, so that they may stand on more level footing with the greater Bourbon Empire, who would have now set its sights on the increasingly troublesome Netherlands as well as its allies, setting the stage for a new series of wars for dominance, and that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.